Global readiness is a very big topic, and there are several components that are very specific to content when we talk about global readiness. The first thing to think about are the words themselves. So when we look at global readiness from a word standpoint, we're looking at a number of things. One is how many words are in your sentence. That's really an amazingly important component of global readiness. When people write, particularly nowadays, they're writing these very long, sometimes very complicated sentences that no one understands in English and certainly cannot be translated. They're just not global ready. So the number of words in your sentence seems like such a petty, small thing, but it's actually really important. Content global readiness and words also has to do with terminology and controlling your terminology. And the reason for that is a few things. One is translation, that if you say the same thing the same way every time you say it, the cost of your translations are going to go way down. If instead you decide that this is the world's greatest novel or the next action video and you don't use the same words to mean and say the same thing, you're going to pay for it in every single language. Cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. So managing your terminology is really important for translation. It's also really important for understandability in the source language. And by that I would mean English, if that's the language you're starting from. Some companies start from other languages, but whatever your source language is, to keep your content readable, make sure you say the same thing the same way in as few words as possible, as clearly as possible. That will make your content both global ready in terms of ready for translation, and global ready in terms of people who have English or your source language as a second language, a third language. So that really will help your global readiness. There are lots of other things with words that impact content and global readiness. The next one that would come to mind would be jargon and idioms. It's really amazing how often they slip into our writing. They're in our spoken word constantly, and we use them without even thinking about it anymore. And when that content goes to any other part of the world, if it's translatable or if anyone tried to translate it, it probably makes absolutely no sense. There are countless examples of magic bullets and hitting it out of the park, and there are other ones that we don't think about, like rise and shine. A customer of mine had that, rise and shine. That's meaningless in another country. Good morning, it's time to wake up. Okay, I think that's meaningful, but not rise and shine. Images play a very big factor in global readiness. There are many, many mistakes that we make along the way with imagery. Let's take maps, for example. Sometimes we really need maps. We need directions to how to find us or how to locate a place, and those can be very relevant. But sometimes we refer to maps and the maps change, particularly when we're looking at maps that are more global, not, oh, I'm on Main Street and how do I get to First Street? But when we're looking at maps of the Soviet Union, that's now Russia and all of the other countries, or East and West Germany, maps can get outdated sometimes rather quickly. Same is true for flags. And a lot of companies use flags in their content, and using flags may not be a good idea to be truly global ready, because flags also change, and people can take great offense. They can really be offended if you've used the wrong flag, or the flag, there's a conflict over the flag. So I would be very careful with flags, and I would be very, very careful with images that include people. We don't think about the types of images that we use and the effect or the interpretation they may have in other cultures. Hand gestures, just don't ever use them. Do yourself a favor and just don't do a hand gesture when you're photographed, because it's going to be on the internet and someday you'll be sorry. You'll think it was just a little nothing to you and it had a terrible meaning somewhere else. The same with other imagery. If you're going to take your imagery of people in particular and take those same photographs and use them in multiple countries, in multiple areas of the world, be very careful that you're not offending anyone who's in a culture that's not yours with the images that you use. Inadvertent imagery problems can be complete disasters for companies. It's very interesting in the relationship between structured content and terminology. People don't think about the relationship between structuring their content and reusing their words. In the world of structured authoring, we usually think of chunks of content. Sometimes we call them topics. And we think about reusing those small pieces of content again and again and again in different kinds of deliverables, perhaps for different kinds of output. And we try to build our information asset, our bigger final published piece out of these different snippets of content. So how does that relate to terminology? Well, if I have different writers, or even the same writer, writing different chunks of content on the same day or different days, it's very possible that I'm going to end up with different words for the same thing. For example, my favorite example has to do with my favorite pet, which is a dog. So let's just say I could call a dog, a canine, a puppy, a poodle. Let's just use those four. And I'm writing a book on what to do with this creature. I could have someone who wrote a chapter or a topic on how to feed the dog. And then another person could write a chapter on how to wash the puppy. And another person could write a chapter on how to walk the canine. And on their own, each topic or chapter is perfectly fine. We've reused that word canine or puppy. It makes perfect sense, it's great. But when I try to build that book or that video about what to do with this animal, I am now unbelievably confusing. Is it a dog? Is it a poodle? Does it only apply to a poodle? Is it only a puppy? Is it a canine? What's a canine? So it's really critical that in the world of structured authoring, you pay very strict, close attention to controlling your terminology. This is something that people are missing, and I see many disasters when we get to the very end of the process and we give it a final read-through, and it no longer makes any sense. Creating content that's in line with your corporate standards has historically been something very difficult to do. There are two different methodologies for doing this, achieving this goal, which is content that is in line with your corporate standards. One is what I call a pull methodology. A pull methodology is just that. I have to pull information to check against. So imagine that I'm writing and I'm creating my content, and I have to think about my style rules, my style guide. And I have to stop and think, gee, am I allowed to use passive voice? Am I allowed to use contractions? Am I allowed to use a verb in this way? And I stop what I'm doing, and I have to go find the style guide. And then I have to look it up. And I have to see if it's even in the style guide, and then make a decision, if it is, on what I've written versus what the style guide wants. And the same is true with terminology. Gee, am I allowed to use this word? Is it capitalized this way? Did we change that product name? Maybe we changed that product name. Maybe I need to stop and figure out, where's my terminology list? Is that product name in there? And I'm in the middle of everything I'm doing and I'm under deadline, but I have to go and pull that information. The problem with pull methodology is that nobody has time for it. Instead, what's better is to use push methodology, where I have software that actually is programmed with all of my rules and all of my terms, and as I'm writing, it pushes that information to me.